Okay. We're now dealing largely with the Renaissance in the 1400s, and let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask you to look upon our country and all those suffering under the weight of the pandemic. We ask you to send us medical people that know how to deal with the issue, make us docile to what they ask from us, and let us truly fight this as a community. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Okay, so we're going through the Renaissance now. The enthusiasm for the ancient world, which, as you know, is the very heart of the Renaissance. The Renaissance means rebirth. It was the rebirth of Roman and Greek culture. It led to the foundation of academies. Now, we oftentimes use the word academy, and in our tradition, academy means a school, but it really was something very different. It says people from all fields were enlisted for the discussion of topics. So that there would be a topic. If you know anything historically about the salons of Paris in the, let's say the 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, the salons of Paris were exactly this way. It says people from all fields were enlisted for a discussion of topics. There would be theologians, philosophers, artisans, scientists, and medical doctors, and they would all look at the same topic from their particular point of view. Now, what we're talking about is a group of people from very different disciplines, but very educated, and people who knew what they were talking about, and they would take a particular point and deal with it. They began to notice in probably the 1960s, they began to notice that if you have a good education in some field, but no education in another field, you're actually a good person to talk to in that field. I'll give you the experiment they did. They wanted to build in Texas. They wanted to build a storehouse in which they could maintain a rather constant temperature as cheaply as possible. And so they brought together a group of people. I don't remember who all was in it, but let me tell you, one of them was an architect, one was a chemist, one was a, I forget what you call a person who deals with reptiles and insects and stuff like that. That particular person, and about 5 other people. And they brought them together and to discuss the building. And this was called cybernetics. And when they brought the people together, they actually designed a building that took no electricity, sat in the desert in Texas, and maintained a constant temperature. And when they got together, they were discussing about different things, and the engineer was saying that a building that is white will cast the sunlight away and tends to remain cooler. And a building that is black will absorb the sunlight and become warmer. So in the discussion, they decided that what they needed was a building where the roof would change colors. And so, of course, they started discussing different ways of panels and all this sort of thing. And the man who dealt with lizards and everything, he says, you know, lizards change the colors of their skin. And they say, like a chameleon, for instance. They say, well, how did they do that? There are little spots of color in the skin of the lizard, and the lizard can expand them or contract them. It's not done consciously by the lizard. Their body does it. But it can expand them or contract them to create any color it wants by putting the spots together. So what they did was basically, when they got finished, they covered the building with a black material in which were set something like ping pong balls. And if it got hot, the ping pong balls expanded and the roof became white. And if it got cold, they contracted, the roof became black. But you know, an engineer would never think of that. Nor would an architect ever think of that. Nor would someone who's studying lizards ever be involved in building a building. But the advantage is to bring people from a different background together, and their expertise does something amazing. And that was what academies originally did, and that's what the salons of Paris did. This became the heart of philosophy in ancient Greece. They used to bring in experts. They just didn't have a lot of experts in different fields in Greece, but this is what the philosophy was in Greece. The most famous academies were in Florence under the direction of a man called Marcello Ficino. The goals of these academies were not just knowledge, but a way of speaking, acting, thinking, and living. So that also, as we've mentioned earlier here about preachers having, let's say, a knowledge of how to transfer what they're talking about into the language of common people. It wouldn't be good to have an artist and a doctor sitting there if the artist is talking about nuances in color that the doctor knows nothing about, and the doctor's naming organs in the human body that the artist knows nothing about. They have to be people who can speak a common language and bring the power of their expertise into it. So it teaches you a way of acting, it teaches you a way of being, thinking, and living. And academies became the great thing at this time, and they really trained people to be very powerful individuals. John Pico della Maroglia, a student in Florence Academy, tried to unite the spirit of academies with the idea of the church. So he brought in basically to look at the church itself as an academy of all these different people who come together. He lived only 31 years. He studied, read, and wrote at a feverish pitch his entire life. He was very famous. He began to put together all knowledge in every discipline into a single system, and he made 900 theses, points that could be agreed on by all these different things. So a doctor, a priest, this sort of thing, that basically you take something like there is only one universe. Fine. What we see actually exists. What would the very simple things, and what would they agree on? And he offered to debate anyone, but many were worried that his points might not be Christian. You have to be very careful at this time because they considered the church the center of the world and the Pope in charge of everything. So you had to be very careful with anything that made the church equal to other things. It's kind of like we were talking about with regards to the, the universe under Copernicus. When Copernicus began to suggest that maybe human beings weren't the center of the universe, it was catastrophic. So this is going on now with the church. So the Pope halted the debates. He imprisoned the man briefly in France, but the man returned to Florence and became a friend of Savonarola. And we'll talk a little bit about Savonarola now. Savonarola in 1482 was a powerful preacher in Florence who attacked lay people and clerics alike for their sinful lives. He came from Bologna and had been strongly supported by the Medici family. You couldn't do anything in Florence if you weren't supported by the Medicis. So when he came to Florence, he was very, very powerfully supported by the Medicis. And what he did was calling people to a certain holiness of life. And one way to do it is to call people to a way of living. Another way is to condemn the ways people shouldn't live. Well, he had a knack for condemning and naming names, which, as you can imagine, made him very popular with most people, but very unpopular with certain people. But he did not discriminate. Rich, poor, lay people, clerics, he had no problem. He spoke of them. He was an extremist and a fanatic who began to take part in very violent events, always claiming that he was justified by God because he had certain visions where God was telling him what to do. I think you know that that's the bane of religion. The bane of religion is an individual who has no contact with other people who judge him or people he would compare ideas with or anything. He is in direct contact with God, and that's all there is to it. And Savonarola was that kind of a person. Charles VIII invaded Italy, and Savonarola supported him for 4 years. He ruled Florence. When Charles came in, he put Savonarola, basically in charge. He ruled Florence. And so one of the things about people with really extreme views, as soon as any kind of controls are taken off them, they go berserk. And Savonarola did this. He decided that the luxuries and works of art in Florence were leading people away from the Lord. And he organized a huge fire, persuading people to throw these things into the fire. And this is canonized by the phrase, I think you've heard the term bonfire of the luxuries, something like that. But that's what happened here. They started a huge bonfire. A huge number of very ancient and very important manuscripts were lost. Paintings by people like Raphael and stuff like that were thrown in. People were just very enthusiastically. They threw in what they had, and then they broke into the houses of many wealthy people and took out very fine works of art. He demanded the reform of the Pope, Alexander VI. That's never a good move. Who was well known for his public sinning. Alexander VI, if anyone ever condemns popes, he's the model. He had girlfriends, he had a wife, he had children, he made his children cardinals. I mean, it's hard to imagine anything wrong with a pope that wasn't wrong with Alexander. He demanded a council to remove the pope. Slowly, he lost the support of the people. He was imprisoned, he was tortured, and finally, he was burned at the stake, in Florence. Bernardine of Feltri was concerned about the poor who were not able to borrow money. He was a Franciscan, and I think in order to borrow money, it's one of the funny things, you have to have money, because you have to have something to borrow money against. Like if you have a house, you can borrow money against the house. But someone who has nothing, you can't borrow money. And so he saw this. He was a Franciscan and a powerful preacher. He very advanced quickly in his studies, and the principle of his studies was humanism, this thing in the Middle Ages. He traveled all over Italy as a preacher and often encountered fierce opposition. At this time, particularly the very wealthy people who had everything, didn't want to hear the thing of reform. At the same time, people who had nothing were enthusiastic for the reform. It's really interesting. People are always very excited to see someone else reform, and that's kind of what was going on. He founded leading institutions to serve the poor. They were called Mountains of Piety. And today in Italian, the term Mountains of Piety is actually the word for a pawn shop. And so he spread these over Italy in order to make money available to poor people. 1447, Catherine Felici. She was from a noble family in Genoa and had an education that was both religious and humanistic, strong humanistic. She wanted to be a nun, but her family forced her into a marriage with another noble to cement the relationship between the families. I think at this time, and this would come up to very close to our own day. I bet this idea isn't 200 years old. Before the French Revolution, if you were in a royal family, your marriage was for the benefit of the country. So if we needed a treaty with that country, then a daughter in this family married a son in that family. And I think that's also why it became very, very common in royal families to everyone to have mistresses and boyfriends and that sort of thing, because their marriage was a political thing. So their love life was really something else. But they were to produce an heir that would unite the people. You would find that in Catherine of Aragon with Henry VIII as well. That was why the marriage thing was a problem. So Catherine had a great influence on her high-living husband. And so what they did, remember he was a nobleman, they moved into a small house near a hospital, and they began to take care of the sick. She took over the hospital and would serve many of the sick and poor in their own homes. Her inspiration led many to follow her example, and charitable activity like this began to flourish all over Italy. What am I showing you now? If you watched in the sort of flow of this, the church was really sinking into a terrible corruption. And as the church sank into the corruption, there were very serious calls for reform that were largely ignored. Now I'm going through a group of individuals who decided simply to reform themselves. Some of them tried to do it to society, like Savonarola, but I want you to know that the reformation of the church did not begin at the top. It began with these individuals who began to reform in different ways. Erasmus was the illegitimate son of a priest. He was educated by the Brethren of the Common Life, a Catholic community of lay people, and entered an Augustinian monastery. If you remember, we discussed maybe 2 studies ago this Brethren of the Common Life. They were started by a gentleman to bring about reform, and they were having problem with their bishops. So he encouraged all of them to join the Augustinians so that under the Augustinian order, they'd be under the Pope and be exempt from their local bishop, okay? So he's one of them who did enter the Augustinian monastery. Through his association with Thomas More, we'll study a little bit about Thomas More later, he experienced a powerful religious conversion and spent the rest of his life in the study of Scripture and the fathers of the church. Thomas More was chancellor in England, and long before Henry VIII appointed him chancellor in England, he had the reputation of being the holiest and the brightest man, just a very strong mind and a very disciplined man. He's regarded as the last person in history who had a complete grasp of civil law and canon law simultaneously. He was a great, great figure and very disciplined in his own life. Most of the people who came in contact with him ended up virtually saints on their own. Thomas More was canonized. He wanted to present a philosophy of Christ. This is this Erasmus. He embodied the optimism and love of learning that are the hallmarks of the humanist. I'd like you to notice that. The hallmark of the humanist is that first, they are optimistic. A humanist has this basic belief, to the degree people get educated and learn, they'll make right decisions. You have to give them the correct thing. They have to hear the truth. But if people know the truth, they will make the right decisions, even if they're difficult. So that makes a humanist a person who is very, very optimistic. And they also have a great love of learning, because I think you arrive at the truth through study and learning. Erasmus, who himself was a priest, wrote in 1502 that a layman would be insulted to be called a priest. So in 1517, he wrote that, in 1502 rather, he wrote that any layman, if they were called a priest, considered it an insult. And now he's in England. Why would they consider it an insult? Because priests were living so far from their norm of life. You know, we went through this a few years ago when the pedophilia cases were going on in the church, that you were almost embarrassed to admit you were a priest. And any layman who was called a priest would certainly make sure people knew that they were not. And so the priests at this time were not living according to their rules at all. In books, he sarcastically criticized priests who equated religion with pilgrimages and money. Okay? One of the things about religion, there's all kinds of things connected with religion, and if what you're about is religion, all these connections are good. But if you have these connections and not the heart of religion, they become evils. And I think of it in terms of a car. I'm a person who's known nothing about mechanics. And so when I look at a car, I look at how comfortable the seats are. Do I like the color? I go through a whole list of things, none of which matter. Now, all those things are really good if you actually have an engine that works in the car. But I don't know anything about the engine, so I tend to look at these things. The danger in religion, people do that too. They look at the size of the churches. They look at the beauty of the ceremonies. All those things are good. But the heart of religion is a relationship with God. And that has to be there at the center. Okay? In 1517, he wrote many letters expressing his optimism, foreseeing a golden age in the future. And the interesting thing is, in his letters, if you read, the church has yet to go through the Reformation in the study we're going through. So while he looked forward to a golden age, before the golden age, there's going to be the disaster of the breakup of Christianity. But after that, we do, in fact, enter the golden age that he foresaw. In 1500, many humanists combined serious study with efforts to bring about church reform. This deeply religious humanism was flourishing in the entire Catholic world. So this idea of seeing humanity at the center, well, that's what religion is. Religion is all about treating people the way God calls us to do it. Not about all other things, but it's about treating people the way God calls us to do it. So it began to bring about a reform, and we'll look at some of them. In Spain, Cardinal Francisco fought against abuses like the selling of indulgences and holding a church office for the benefits and not doing the ministry. That was called absenteeism. So, like for instance, I give you an example. He wasn't an example of absenteeism, but he could have been. When I was in Sacred Heart in Salinas, there was a very elderly priest by the name of Monsignor Early. Monsignor Early hated to preach, and I should mention the congregation felt the same. But Monsignor Early, what he used to do, he usually had 5 or 6 priests in the rectory, and like when I was entering the diocese, I spent a year with him before I entered the diocese. Lots of priests would stay there, and he'd invite them to stay, but then he had priests to do the masses for him. Now, he loved to say Mass, so he would say Mass and have them preach. But you know, if he had been gone for 5 years, it would have been no change in the way parish was running. Well, at this time in history, there was a certain, it's called a benefice. There's a certain salary that was assigned to the pastor of a church. So if I was the pastor of Mission San Luis Obispo, I would get the salary of a pastor whether or not I ever came to San Luis Obispo. And there were people who would buy pastorates in 5 or 6 churches and get the incomes from all of them, live a very wealthy life as a priest, and never say Mass, never be involved in any parish. That was called absenteeism. So this cardinal really fought against it. He founded a university, and he published a Bible in Hebrew, Syriac, Greek, and Latin. And the idea, if you know more than one language, it's really an interesting thing to take a Bible in, let's say, the 2 languages you know, 2 Bibles, and read the same passage side by side. Whenever you translate a text, you automatically give a color to it in the new language, because words do not translate exactly. So you give it sort of a color by translating it. And if you can look at a text in several different translations, it really gives you a much richer understanding of the meaning of the text than you would find in any translation. Best, of course, if you can read Hebrew and understand it, and read Greek and understand it, and read Aramaic and understand it. Then you can read the entire Bible in the original languages. There just aren't many people who can do that. So, in France, Jacques Lefebvre Estable became a powerful teacher, turning from the study of Aristotle to the study of church reform. Now, I looked at Aristotle. Remember, the big thing about Aristotle is evidence. Aristotle is the one who began to look at things, and he wouldn't just sit down and dream about it. He'd look at things and study them very, very carefully. He looked at evidence. Most people look at Aristotle as the beginning of science, okay? He didn't just daydream about things. Many of his students went on to be important figures in their desire for church reform. So they were planted. In Germany, the humanistic desire for the reform of the church centered in the great centers of printing. So we've watched in Germany and in England, it centered in these academies where people would come together and discuss things and then see about the reform and that sort of thing. In Germany, it's centered in the printing press. Now remember, why is that so crucially important? The Reformation will begin in Germany, where Luther is able to publish all these books and pamphlets and send them all over. So Johannes Ruschen published his first Hebrew grammar, the first ever written by a Christian. He taught Hebrew and fought against bigots who advocated the destruction of all Hebrew books, and encouraged every university to establish a chair of Hebrew studies. The prejudice against the Jews is well known. It's well known in Germany. It goes way, way back beyond where we are today. We're talking here the 1500s, and there was a bigotry against having the Jewish books in the Bible, a bigotry against having the study of Hebrew, having people getting to understand the language for reading Scripture. And so he fostered this against a lot of opposition. Eastern Europe began to be influenced by humanism because of many students who were returning from studies in Italy. They'd gone to Italy, they'd studied, gone to Pisa and these areas where they had the universities, Florence, and when they came back from Italy, they all were touched by humanism. So they began to bring it into Eastern Europe. Educated people, bishops and nobles, began to be fascinated by the new ideas. Again, humanism is really found among educated people. So these people began to look at these ideas. In Hungary, the head archbishop and the king both favored the establishment of printing presses to spread these new ideas of humanism. The king went on to establish a great library that actually survives to this day. It's in Budapest, but it's a huge library. So Hungary now is following Germany in the idea of the use of printing. In Poland, people learning of the new ideas brought them to the attention of the Archbishop of Cracow, and he became the very first humanist in the country. Cracow is the most important diocese in Poland. I forget the name of the capital of Poland, but the capital is not Krakow, but the ancient capital was Krakow, and Krakow is to this day the center of the church in Poland. A literary society was founded in Krakow by a German, and the visiting Italians interested in royalty in the humanism. In Poland, there was also a revival of a great interest in Plato. Remember, the humanism seemed to concentrate a lot on Aristotle, and Aristotle was a pupil of Plato. He followed Plato. So now they begin to look at Plato again. Notice again, we're talking Germany here. King George of Bohemia. Bohemia is today, let's see, can't think of the name of it. It's the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic's Bohemia. So using the principles of the humanists, they began to draw up a project for universal peace. Remember, we've already seen a beginning of the fomenting in Bohemia. In the capital of Bohemia, there was a man by the name of Huss. Remember, began the teaching. He's basically seen as the founder of the Baptist community, and he was there. So these ideas are already there. The intention of this project was to try and unite Catholic Europe against the Turks. See, as Catholic Europe was beginning, these different nations were beginning to feel strong nationalistic ideas to draw together. They began to use them as a point of separating. What had united Europe originally was the religion. They were united by the religion. Now the point of unity became their individual kings. And as a result of this, they were fighting among themselves while the Turks had become very well organized and were moving across Europe. And so he wanted to get them united against the Turks. The papacy at this time also accepted humanism, and the popes became patrons of the arts, scholarship, and literature. This is the whole attitude that would eventually produce St. Peter's Basilica, where you see, things by Michelangelo and Raphael and the greatest painters of history. All this stuff is in there. And that's because that's a result of humanism. Humanism, I say, the end result of humanism is always beauty. You end up with beauty in literature, in art, in the way they look at things, the kindness with which they do things, and they're beautiful people because they're optimistic. But beauty is what results from this. In the areas of politics, the popes were very involved in trying to unite Europe against the Turks. And in that effort, they made many poorly thought out compromises, giving great control over the church to European rulers. So what they did was, in order to get, let's say, a king involved in a treaty they wanted, they would give the king the right to appoint bishops in their country, or give the king the right over church lands in their country. And so the popes were not very strong at this time, and their efforts to somehow make Europe strong actually weakened the whole thing. They allowed the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition. For instance, the Spanish government got permission to conduct the Inquisition. The Inquisition, most people look at it as connected with the church, but it's really connected with the Spanish government. The judges and the people who ran it were clerics, but they were running it for the Spanish government. And what they would do in order to execute a person, they would accuse them of heresy. But really, what they were accusing them of was disloyalty to the government. And because the government was Catholic, everyone was Catholic, if you didn't hold Catholic beliefs, you could be condemned. And so the Inquisition did that, and the church became an instrument by which the Spanish rulers could get rid of anyone they wanted. The popes acquired a great deal of money through selling church offices, indulgences, and church lands. And it's at this point that you see that will ultimately bring about the Reformation. The church moves more to being a business than to being a religion. And so they're willing to sacrifice certain principles in effort to acquire money. Again, the result of all this money, again, go to Rome and see St. Peter's Basilica. That's the result of all of this. 1550 rather. Around this time, the area of Spain and Portugal was a collection of very small kingdoms and was in an ideal position to explore the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. Now, I want you to know what we're watching as we go on a little further, a shifting of center of the world from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. It'll switch completely to the Atlantic with the discovery of the New World, where the major countries are the countries on the Atlantic that can trade with the New World and this sort of thing. But we're watching just the beginning of this. So Portugal and Spain were an ideal. Portuguese was the first of these nations to move out, and they went out under the leadership of a king who was called Henry the Navigator. Now, Henry the Navigator, as king, sent ships out exploring and everything. Henry himself never, that I know, was on a ship. Italian sailors and geographers joined in the effort, so that what we watch is Portugal began this time of exploration. They were the first ones. And so people who were really interested in this would come to Portugal in order to be involved in. If you're interested in geography, they would go out on these ships. I don't know if you've ever thought about it. It's an interesting thing to imagine how you would draw a map if you could never go up in a plane or never photograph from the air. And that's what geographers did. So they had to go to places. They had to travel, they had to be on the sea and this sort of thing. And so they went to the places where the traveling was going on. And Italians who were navigators and sailors and this sort of thing went to where someone was fostering this, which happened to be in Portugal. That's the very reason Christopher Columbus, an Italian, actually sailed from Spain. We will find that the Spanish will be the next to do this. Near the end of the 15th century, the discovery of a sea route to India became the dominant goal. And there were a great many famous explorers from Portugal in this period. A lot of very famous names of the early explorers came from Portugal. And what they were trying to do, the whole thing, the world was trying to find a route to India that would go by water. And one of the reasons is there were a lot of jewels, if you talk pearls and all this stuff, a lot of it came from Sri Lanka, but it actually was exported by India. India also brought silk out of China, and they were exporting it. India was a major place for luxury goods. If you wanted luxury goods, had to get them out of India. But because of the way the Muslims were moving in the world, you had to be very careful where you traveled, and oftentimes had to pay huge bounties in order to go through areas. So everyone wanted to find a sea route. If you could find a sea route, you could big these things and get over them. So the two major kingdoms of Spain also was was divided into a bunch of kingdoms, were united when Ferdinand of Aragon married Isabella of Catalonia. And we always speak of them as Ferdinand and Isabella because Isabella used to wear armor and lead the armies from her area, in the same way Ferdinand led the armies from his area. They were two powerful, equal rulers, like two in England were William and Mary. They were a married couple, but it would be hard to say who was the most important. Here, actually, I'm inclined to think even Isabella was the more important. But Ferdinand and Isabella were both leaders of armies and very powerful individuals. They were deeply religious, and they decided to set about and reconquer Spain from the Muslims. Remember, the Muslims had been in Spain 1,000 years at this point. I remember a dinner one time in the rectory here when I was pastor at the mission, and we had a visiting priest, and one of the points of kidding very often at the table, there were two priests who were friends of mine there, and they were kidding me about the fact of the land the Americans had taken from the Native Americans over a period of time. And I always, because of my racial background, would defend the Native Americans. It's our land, we're going to get it back, and this sort of thing. And anyway, they would laugh, and we'd go on through this whole thing. It was very interesting. This priest was at table one time, and one of the priests who was arguing said, "You know, it's been out of Indian hands for 200 years. The chances of getting it back are absolutely impossible." This priest who was visiting was from Spain, and he was eating, and he never looked up from his eating. He just went on, but said, "The Muslims were in Spain for 1,000 years, and they're gone now," and just went on eating. It was a wonderful moment. In 1492, the last of the Muslim strongholds fell to the Spanish, and the last stronghold was Granada. And I'll tell you the story about Columbus and Granada. Columbus was trying to get in to see Ferdinand. He didn't realize Isabella was the more important, but he was trying to get in to see Ferdinand because he wanted finances for his attempt to see if he could find a sea route to India by sailing off the other direction. And he arrived during the siege of Granada. And so the Spanish were sieging Granada, and he wanted to talk to someone, and he couldn't get a hold of Ferdinand, who was arguing with the armies. And Isabella said to him, "I will speak to you as soon as we're finished here." And Granada fell, and Ferdinand was in the process of going through Granada and freeing Christian slaves. But Isabella came back to the camp, and then she saw Columbus. And so Columbus explained to her his harebrained plan to sail off the end of the world. And she got all finished, and she said, "That's impossible." And Columbus said to her, "What did they say about Granada yesterday?" And she looked up, because it was a famous saying, "Granada is unconquerable." And he said, "Everything's impossible till somebody does it." And so he was financed personally by the jewelry of Isabella. That was what personally financed him, not Spain, but Isabella herself. So anyway, the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, claimed for themselves the title Catholic Sovereigns of Spain, and they set about reforming the church and spreading the faith. Now, if you look at it from a Catholic point of view, the reform of the church was wonderful. The other side of this was really a terrible thing. Throughout, they were very harsh on Muslims. They were very harsh on Jews. And if you were a non-Catholic, you were an enemy of Spain. Now you see how this is going to work in with the Spanish Inquisition. But Ferdinand and Isabella, when they took over an area, if you were Jewish or Muslim, you had the opportunity to convert or leave. You could do either one. They didn't necessarily kill you, but you could do either one. And so they attempted to make the country a Catholic country that way. An Italian sea captain convinced Isabella to finance his attempt to find the route to India. His project was named the Enterprise of the Indies. He landed in the Bahamas and called the inhabitants Indians, not because he thought he was in India, but Indian is a corruption of the Italian word indigenous. The reason I mention this is because we think that when he arrived, I was told in school, he thought he was in India, so he called the people Indians. But the reason they wanted to get to India, because they wanted to find a shorter trade route, which meant they'd been trading with Indians for a long time. They knew what Indians looked like, they knew how they dressed, they knew what their art was, they knew everything about Indians, which is why they wanted to get to India. So when they landed there, they did not call them Indians from India, they called them the indigenous, and the corruption of that word became Indian. Columbus believed that he was to explore the world and carry the faith to distant lands. Columbus was a deeply religious man and very concerned about bringing the faith. Oftentimes we find reactions, like there was a statue of Columbus brought down, I think last week. There are lots of times reaction against Columbus on the part of Native Americans, and it's not so much because of what he did with regards to Native Americans, which I think was virtually nil. The early people that were not a problem with Native Americans. But the fact of the matter is, he brought the church in, and because of the disease and everything, irrespective of what Columbus was about, the arrival of Europeans was not good for the Native Americans, so that's the way it's dealt with. As time went on, and he did not reap the great riches from the project, he came to see more and more of a religious project. Columbus didn't see the time of the great amounts of gold and everything that came from the New World. So at this beginning thing, he began to understand from God that his role was much more religious than it was founding the nation, being political and everything. Spain and Portugal decided how the lands were to be divided between the two of them, without any consideration in any way of the native people. So Spain and Portugal divided up. That's why Brazil speaks Portuguese to the day. They divided up the South America in a certain way and set the country that way. At this time, the Portuguese also reached the Congo in 1482. And at first, they were very friendly relationships with a king there called Alfonso I. Alfonso I was a Catholic, and he became a king in the Congo. And soon, the slave trade began. And I'm not sure if you know much how the slave trade began, but the reason for the initiation of the slave trade was they could buy slaves from the tribes. Like, for instance, if you had a tribe here of one group and a tribe of the other, and they conquered one, they would take them as slaves, but then they would sell them to other tribes as slaves or sell them to the Europeans. So they were not capturing blacks initially, but buying slaves from these other people. That's how it began. They would sell captives they'd taken, but soon people who were captured in raids for the slave trade, it began to escalate so that as they began to sell more, then they began as tribes to attack one another just to get slaves, because slaves were a way of making money. In 1526, King Alfonso complained to King John of Portugal, asking at the same time for missionaries to teach in the schools. The Catholic Church was making great progress in the Congo at the time. However, there was too much money involved, and some of the priests actually were slave owners themselves. I don't know if I've ever told you, I had to do a retreat one time in Tallahassee, and the bishop, who I should point out was black, the bishop took me into his office, and while we were meeting in the office, above his desk was hanging a very, very large print of a photograph, and I think it was about 5 feet by 2.5, a very large print. And it was the original bishop of Tallahassee with his slaves, that they were slaves of the bishop. And the present bishop then is black. There was an attempt on the life of King Alfonso by some Portuguese, and in 1539, he appears to have disappeared from history, this Alfonso. But his whole thing was to bring the faith in, but they were making too much money on slaves. And so they sacrificed that. The amount of insane decisions that have been made both in the church and governments in favor of money, and how the penalty has been paid over a long period of time, is astronomical. There wouldn't be enough books in the world to hold that information. In 1540, a Polish priest named Nicolaus Copernicus claimed that the earth and humans were not the center of the universe, but the sun was. You can imagine the shock that was. He worked with mathematical calculations and proved many of the difficulties in understanding the movements of the heavens that could not be explained clearly in any other way. Like, he looked at the way they consider we're the center of the universe and things go around us. Well, if things go around us and stuff, you have something like Halley's Comet, that isn't going around us because of the way it comes and goes. And different phases of the sun, the planets and stuff, it just didn't make sense, but they couldn't figure out how. Now, he used simple mathematics, and using the simple mathematics, he discovered we are not the center of the universe. He did not fully prove his theories, but his work would be supported by Kepler and Galileo, and near the end of the 17th century by Newton. So he's the beginning of this movement that I think you'd continue it right up to Stephen Hawking in our own day. But it's this movement of the study of the universe. The process of this development of this theory is a good example of how the progress of Europe, of thinking in Europe, was going on in every field. So because we're studying here like church history, we are looking at how this study, humanism, now is affecting the church and bringing out reform and bringing up these great people who come forward, brilliant people who are calling for the reform and the change of the church. But this is going on in astronomy too, with the same voice that he looks up and says, we're not the center of the universe. You find exactly the same voice in the church saying, we can't live these lives and call ourselves a church. That these voices began to come out, and this is humanism and education. So we'll stop it here and pick it up here next week. Thanks very much.